Hello, folks and friends. Today I'm going to be talking about the notion that it only takes one person, one spouse, to change a marriage. This notion came up in conversation, and I'm the one who said it, and I didn't really get to dig in deeper into that, but I was thinking more about it and how, depending on how one receives that, it can be a little vague of what that really means and what that looks like and the expectations that are attached to that notion. And so when I heard that phrase and have heard at least like the concept of it, though not concretely attached to any sort of book or article or person who's communicated that idea. But I mean, just like on the immediate onset, I think when anybody hears that kind of notion, I think naturally there's just a sense of doubt and maybe frustration about that sentiment, because I think it would be really easy to think that it's not true. I think it's easy to kind of pick apart it and kind of feel like, well, if it takes one person to change a marriage, well, you just hope you're not going to be the one. You're not the one spouse who has to make the change. But anyways, I struggled with that notion. Just I remember the first immediate time I heard it, and I think it is in general just kind of like an unsettling notion to hear. So I kind of wanted to unpack it a bit, just based on my interpretation, what I think about that notion. Again, not, I just want to clarify and caveat that I haven't read a book. I know that there's books out there that have mentioned this notion. Maybe there's like a certain person, and like, I don't know how they are particularly interpreting it or communicating it to their audience, how they want to receive that notion. I'm purely just going to be talking based on how I interpret that notion, the notion that it only takes one person to change a marriage. And I just kind of want to unpack it a little bit and, yeah, just kind of share some of my thoughts about the whole thing, because I personally kind of struggled with it and still kind of wrestle with it a bit, because I think there are maybe expectations attached to it that can be a bit misleading. Not that anybody's making another person think this way, but I think naturally, just as human beings, when we hear this notion, I think there are just natural expectations we have on the other person, even if we're the one that's going to be making the change in our marriage, if that makes sense. And so I guess I just wanted to share some of my thoughts about it and my personal interpretation, of what I think about this whole sentiment. So just to begin here, I think success, happiness, and contentment in marriage comes down to like two basic principles. Maybe this isn't like the culmination of of success and happiness and contentment in marriage, but I do think these are two pretty key factors. The first being how much you're willing to accept your spouse as they are, is number one. And the other factor, the second factor, is how much you're willing to sacrifice your own desires, preferences, and display love and affection toward your spouse without receiving anything back in return. And the amount that each individual spouse is willing to give that, the first being just like an acceptance of the way the person, the way your spouse operates, functions, communicates, accepting that, truly accepting that, not having some sort of resentment or being begrudging about it, but just accepting this is kind of the way my spouse is. That is to this present day. You don't know what they're going to be like, down the line or whatever, but just that in general, how much you're willing to accept your spouse. And then when there's desire for change and, you have your own preferences, how much you're willing to, yeah, give that up, but particularly with giving that up, still displaying love and affection towards your spouse. That second part is very key, because it's easy to say, fine, I accept my spouse as the way they are, and I kind of am willing to give up and sacrifice my desires and stuff for marriage and, our dynamic or way of communicating. But even though I accept and I'm willing to accept them and willing to make sacrifices, because it's not the way that I wish or desire it to be, I'm going to be withholding love, affection, affirmation, like a pursuit of the other, because it's not how I want my marriage to be or how I would want my spouse to be or our dynamic to be. But if you are willing to still give love and affection, support, affirmation to your spouse, despite them not kind of being the way you would like and prefer them to be, I think when both spouses are doing that, that is what creates, I think, maximum growth and puts your marriage on the trajectory of success, happiness, and contentment. Now, it's not so with the notion that it only takes one to change a marriage, if that is not the case, if only one party, I think the reality is if only one party is willing to do these two aspects that I just communicated, or um they're not both equally willing to do two of those aspects. Maybe one is, more willing to accept the other, and the other one is more willing to give love and affection and kind of sacrifice it. Whatever amount that you're giving within those two factors, that's what's going to dictate, whether or not your marriage can kind of reach its peak of joy and happiness and contentment that it potentially could. And I think that is the ideal. I think that's the goal. I think that's the beautiful thing that we should be striving for is a mutual pursuit of these two factors. If there is not that pursuit of those two factors, I think the reality is that you can still have a successful, happy, content marriage. The reality is just if it's only one person doing it, hypothetically, that it's just not going to be able to, in a sense, reach its heights and capacities that it maybe could be. And maybe that's okay. Like it doesn't necessarily have to. Is it the ideal? No, but I'm just saying you don't have to believe that just because you're kind of the one or only one spouse is kind of doing the heavy lifting, that there can't be any sort of happiness, there can't be any sort of contentment, there can't be any sort of satisfaction in your marriage, and that it's automatically going towards the trajectory of failure if only one spouse hypothetically is making that change. So I do think, number one, it being mutual is very important. But now I'm going to go into if it's not mutual, if hypothetically one spouse is just, not willing to change, not willing to accept the other, not willing to make sacrifices and be loving and kind to their spouse without getting anything in return, what does that mean when only one, so getting into what does it mean that it only takes one person to change a marriage? And I think this is what this notion is communicating. The way in which your marriage changes when only one person is, in a sense, putting in the hard work and making the big changes in the marriage, I think that the marriage can definitely change for good, just not in the way that maybe you expect or maybe hope to. But it doesn't mean that it's not moving in a good trajectory or that there's not hope for your marriage. Because I think the reality is that, yeah, when you do have only one spouse kind of putting in the effort and putting in, the energy and making those sacrifices, I mean, just like the reality is that they're doing the heavy lifting and it's going to be harder on that one spouse than if both of you were doing the lifting together. Like, that's just the reality. It's not to say that things can't get off the ground. It just might not get up the ground as fast as it could, as efficiently as it could, as maybe steadily as it could, but that doesn't mean it's completely gone. So when I think of the notion that it takes one person to change a marriage, I think maybe a misconception that could come about is that if you, because I want to clarify, I'm not assuming that I know what other authors or people have said about this notion and how they are viewing it. But this is what I just think naturally as a person would tend to believe if they were to take on this notion that it only takes one person to change a marriage. And I think the misconception could be easily this, or one could, maybe have these underlying expectations, whether they should or not. But that if you start changing, so hypothetically, you decide, I'm going to be the one who's going to be the one to make the change in our marriage because I obviously see that there are issues. I see that there's things that need to be changed. And so you start becoming more patient. You start just kind of bearing criticism a bit more. You stop complaining, you stop nagging, you stop doing all of the things that are just creating conflict in your marriage. Um, you just kind of accept things. You don't blow up, you just kind of offer up the sufferings to our Lord and move on, which I think is really good and beautiful. I think sometimes with this notion, and I think there could be a misconception that because because I think sometimes the association with this notion is that when you start to change, then your spouse will also change, which does happen. It does. I'm not saying it's completely unrealistic or it doesn't happen where you start making all these changes and virtue naturally draws out virtue from other people. The reality is that convicting people convict other people the same way that hurt people, right? So if like you're being a light, if you're being more of an example of virtue, you would hope and you would think that that's going to affect your spouse to hopefully motivate them to do better, to be more kind, more loving, more patient, more helpful, all of these different things. I think that's not an unrealistic desire or expectation to have. But I think if you believe that by you changing, that is automatically going to mean that they are going to change, I think that expectation could lead to just disappointment because it's not really about the whole notion isn't really, I think, in my opinion, it's not really about even your spouse changing. It's you changing. It's you becoming the person that weathers a difficult marriage. And that's what changes the marriage. That because you're growing in virtue, because you're the one making the changes, that your marriage becomes one that you can become happy with, that you can accept and be detached from, maybe the disappointments and hurts that you've experienced, and therefore you're happy. Just your marriage therefore becomes happy naturally or automatically because you become a different person, not because your spouse changes. Because you've changed and now your dynamics are suddenly different. That does happen. I think that is true. I think that does happen. But I think if you go into this notion saying, I'm going to be the one that changes with this underlying hope that my spouse is going to change too, I think that's not a fully correct interpretation of the notion. And I think you could easily just like tempt disappointment and hurt and bitterness if you don't see your spouse changing, even though you're making all of these changes. And so I think the key thing within the notion of being the one to change, or that it only takes one to change a marriage, is that the individual person changes so that whatever kind of marriage, in a sense, that they encounter or have, or whatever their spouse is doing, they're still able to find joy, happiness, and contentment within the marriage because of the virtue in which they are transforming themselves to have more so, the perspectives and outlooks that they are having towards their spouse. I think those are the things that really make them like change the marriage when one chooses to change, not that why you changing your spouse automatically changes. And I think the reality, honestly, like thinking about that kind of notion, because I was kind of wrestling it with myself, like thinking about that kind of notion, I think is disappointing. You think it? I think that notion is just naturally kind of disappointing if you don't believe in God, that if you don't have faith, if you don't have our Lord to cling to, and in a sense you are unbelieving and um yeah, like there's no hope for salvation or, anything beyond this life. Like if there's nothing else to it, that notion is despairing, is kind of depressing, and you would understand, or I can understand why someone would reason if that's what it means to be the one to change the marriage, not that to change my marriage, which is I'm the one who just has to do all the heavy working, change, become more virtuous. That's the kind of win I get in the end, not even the spouse that I want. Then forget that. I'm not putting in all of this work to get just, like the second best of things, and my spouse doesn't even change in the end. I would say, yeah, just forget it and move on and find somebody else who's going to be a better suit for me. Like I can, not that I actually believe, I don't believe that, but that I can understand why somebody would reason that. But I think the difference is with the notion of it only takes one person to change a marriage, and that change means you being changed. you becoming a more virtuous person through a difficult marriage, and in a sense, being able to weather whatever kind of dynamics and hardships your marriage throws at you and still kind of come out on top. As a believing, faithful Catholic and somebody who believes in eternal salvation, like, in a sense, the payout in that, at the bare minimum, which I'm gonna say how that's kind of it's actually not bare minimum, but, like, at the bare minimum, even if you don't get the kind of relationship and dynamic with your spouse that you desire, at the very least, you depend and cling to our Lord. You see this and use, the hardship and the changes that you have to make, the detachment that you have to cultivate, for your own desires, and, just cling to our Lord and to entrust his marriage to you, entrust his spouse sorry, entrust your marriage to him, entrust your spouse to him. If at the bare minimum, that's what occurs and that's what happens, you come out with a stronger relationship with our Lord, that's a complete win. Like, that's beyond win. That's not even the bare minimum. That's actually the goal. And so I think that's where the whole notion, I think, really is joy-filled and is light-filled, and it kind of turns itself around, because without that, it does seem kind of despairing. But when you realize that when you change and you're the one who's making the efforts to change your marriage, and that person that you become within that change is the kind of person that clings to our Lord, has a stronger relationship with our Lord, trusts in him, kind of offers up all the sacrifices and sufferings to our Lord, and therefore you just have like a deep and intimate relationship with him, with God. Like, that is ultimately where we should be going, regardless of if we have, like, even if we have an amazing marriage, that is still the goal, that you have complete and utter trust and unity and intimacy with our Lord. So I think, and why I'm saying that I don't think it changes your marriage in the way that maybe people might think. And I totally might be wrong, but that's kind of just how I've looked at it and kind of how I've kind of interpreted it, because I've kind of heard the notion, or I've heard the sentiment that, yeah, like, when you change, like, I've heard these examples where just, when you change, oh, like, your spouse suddenly starts becoming more helpful. They start becoming more patient. They start becoming more, um, more loving and more thoughtful and more sensitive. And that's great. I think that, like, I think that's a good thing. I think that should happen, especially if one person is, yeah, deciding to kind of bite the bullet and take on like, be the first to kind of instigate change. That, yeah, you would hope, with all the hard work, that they ought to be rewarded, and they ought to see the good fruit of, like, their hard work in their marriage and in their relationship. But I'm just saying that that's not always the case, and that shouldn't deter you from doing it. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's actually not even about your spouse changing in the way that you desire them to. It's about you changing, and in the process, you becoming the person that is ultimately going to become a saint. Because it doesn't really matter, honestly, and it's no excuse that just because you have a hard marriage, just because your spouse doesn't communicate with you, you guys don't, you guys are constantly butting heads or fighting and arguing, or they're very unhelpful, and they're not very sensitive or kind, like, whatever the problems that you face in your marriage that everybody kind of faces, like, your spouse is lacking, which I will say, like, that there are definitely spouses out there, I'm sure, that they shouldn't get a free pass. They should change, and they ought to change, and that shouldn't be dismissed. But the reality is that you can't control your spouse. You can't control, in a sense, like, the vices that they have or the convictions that they have. Um, you can obviously talk to them, have conversation, and communicate with them, and, try to come to a resolution. But I mean, at the end of the day, you don't have control over just who they are. Whereas you always have the power to control your own sanctity. Like, you can, regardless of your situation and your marital dynamic, can go beyond that and reach supernatural like heroic virtue, um, despite having maybe a really difficult spouse or just not the kind of marriage that you desire. Because sainthood is not dependent on somebody else. That's just the reality. And I mean, it's not even about, and that notion in and of itself is not even about your marriage, but just that in general, your sanctity is your own personal responsibility, and that nobody else is responsible for making you holy. And I think that's just a really tough, reality to accept. And there are definitely marriages, and there are different, yeah, there's different people who have really hard marriage situations, like maybe with, like, beyond the just kerfluffle of miscommunication and impatience and irritation towards each other, but like there are spouses who, or there are marriages out there that are struggling with pretty large vices that are hard to work through: adultery, you know, addiction, violence, like all of these different things. And I can't speak to kind of how much suffering is that um that weighs on a person, that is demanded of a person. However, the truth is that it's still the same. Like, you're still called to be sanctified through that. That you're still called to overcome and forgive and weather these, like, deep sufferings. But I'm not going to deny that that individual, whatever spouse, has to deal with those kinds of things in their marriage. That is kind of like a abnormal, so to speak, degree of hardship and suffering, and therefore they have to show, in a sense, an abnormal amount of virtue and courage, perseverance in all of these trials. Recently, when I was reading through, before bed, I've been reading through Models of Family Life. It's called Our Lay Saints Models of Family Life by Joanne Cruz, something like that. I'll try to find a link, and I'll link it in the description. But I think these saints, there's a lot of saints in within these stories. They're like little, yeah, just like little kind of biographies of different saints. They show this exactly how I think what it means when one person, um, that it only takes one person to change a marriage. In particular, I think of the saint named Blessed Anna Maria Tagai. And in this summary of her life, she was married to a man who had an extremely hot temper, and he was a very violent man, not towards her, but kind of to everybody else, basically, and to his own children, and to strangers. He was very ill-tempered. And even in there's little kind of snippets within the biography from him, for I suppose just for the process of her canonization. These are the uh, testimonies for her beatification, from him and from his children, or from their children. And their children testify to how hot-headed and how ill-tempered their father was, and how anybody but their mother would have left him, and would not show such a great amount of love and patience for him. And so in this book, it quotes the husband saying the following: "I can assert in very truth that from the beginning of our marriage she never refused my rights, but never asserted her own." And then he goes on to say, "If any of us fell ill, she lavished every attention on us, to the extent of omitting, when necessary, her mass and devotions. As for me, I have always thought in the past, and say now, that God took this excellent servant from me, because I was not worthy to have her." And so I don't know if he, like, you don't know, I don't know the full story, but there's lots of little snippets of him kind of viewing his wife, who was so virtuous, and she's obviously a blessed, and so just a testament of, she was the one, you could tell very clearly just in the story, in a sense, like, she is the one that made the changes, and that's what made change their marriage. And in a sense, it seemed like he had a lot of respect for her, even though he might have not have treated her justly. He had so much respect and admiration for her, and he saw her holiness as one to be desired. And I think with the notion that it only takes one to change a marriage, in a sense, that might be the only sort of conclusion you get, is that your spouse sees your change and admires your change, but maybe just doesn't feel the need or doesn't see to, change things within your marriage themselves or change it themselves to help improve or better your marriage. And that's a big cross and that's a big suffering. But I think at the end of the day, that's in a sense the best you have. And that's not nothing. Like, that's not scrap. So I don't think you should underestimate the power of the sanctity and holiness that one person can attain in a marriage. And even though the reality is that's not, that might not be the preferred, and that God doesn't, desire both of you to be happy and content and holy together. But there is this level kind of like detachment of, what your other spouse is doing. And even though you are called to be united to them, there is a way, I think, a virtuous person, a saintly person can find that. And I think a striving person can find this balance of striving for holiness, realizing that there is, in a sense, a divide, and still unconditionally loving their spouse anyway, still being their advocate, still being there for them. Does it take a tremendous amount of sacrifice, of being willing to bear the hard things, of patience? Yes, absolutely. But that's why there's so much hope and comfort in the fact that you don't do it alone, and you don't do it by your strength, and you don't do it without His grace. So I think, the notion is really beautiful. I just think that sometimes maybe that side isn't communicated, or maybe we don't realize that that's what maybe it could mean, because the notion in and of itself, I think, might promise something that might not actually happen, but that doesn't mean it's not promising something good. So that's just kind of my little treatise, I think, on this whole notion that it takes one to change a marriage. And I hope, it just gives some reflective thoughts to you and your marriage, your own personal growth and holiness. Definitely, I struggle with this notion still. Like, I believe it, and I definitely struggle with it, and which is why, reading the lives of the saints is very powerful. Just reflecting and thinking about who I'm called to be, regardless of my spouse and regardless of really anybody else around me and whatever they're doing and how they've affected me. That my relationship with our Lord and being the woman that He has called me to be, regardless of whether or not I feel like other people deserve the best sides of me, like, whatever, it doesn't matter. That ultimately, like, the goal is union with our Lord, great intimacy with Him, trust and surrender in His divine providence, and having an unwavering commitment to my marriage, regardless of it being the way that I want it to be or not. Anyways, I hope this episode was helpful, fruitful, thoughtful for you. And thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time. God bless.